The Hawker Hurricane, a staple of the RAF during the war years, and also a staple of the Airfix range with the earliest examples starting in the 1950s. It's no surprise then that Airfix have had a Hawker Hurricane in their range almost consistently since then. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me on the workbench today as I build and review the Airfix Hawker Hurricane Mk.1 in 1/72 scale. Let's get this one down onto the workbench. So this version that I've got here, it's not the most recent version, it's a little bit older. I had meant to do it some years ago, but it kind of just sat. There was a small point that put me off, and hopefully I'll remember to talk about that in a minute. But I eventually got it down on the workbench. I had a little bit of motivation, got it down on the workbench and got into it. I do find these kits very enjoyable. These are almost like weekend builds. They're sort of pocket money kits, and I'm sure this probably won't be the last time I build a Hawker Hurricane from Airfix, or in general at least. So let's get a list of the products I used on the screen now to give you an idea of the kind of things you might want to go and get if you fancy replicating what I achieved in this particular build. I have already done a detailed unboxing on this particular kit, so for more information on what's contained within inside the box, such as the plastic parts, decals, etc., check out that particular video. In this one, I'll be focusing on what this kit is like to build and rounding off with a review on the end. As usual, the first thing I'll do is snip the parts that I need away from the sprue using my cutters, and then sand down any rough areas of plastic using a sanding stick or perhaps a sharp knife at times. This fortunately doesn't feature that much in the way of flash. It is a fairly recent tooling, and although it has had a number of production runs, the level of flash is actually still quite minimal. Tamiya Extra Thin Cement will be my glue of choice throughout this build, and the first things to focus on in this build, unusually for an Airfix kit, was actually the landing gear bays. The landing gear bay has a number of parts which need to be assembled together and then inserted into the lower wing half. This includes building up the walls and making sure not to forget to install the clear light part which goes on the bottom of the aircraft. It's at this point we can add the upper wing halves onto the lower wing halves. We have to do it at this point because there are elements of the cockpit which need to be glued in to this upper wing part. With these parts joined together, I did spend a little bit of time sanding the seams just to make them a little bit tidier. Now moving on to the cockpit parts, I had to install the kind of foot rests for the pilot, the rudder pedals, and also the control column. Before I move on, I'm going to flip over and add the missing detail from inside of the landing gear bay. Because I'm doing a slightly earlier version of the Hawker Hurricane, there is a small hole on the inside of the cockpit that needs to be drilled out. This will allow me to install a part on the outside of the cockpit a bit later on. Vallejo liquid mask would be carefully applied to that clear part on the lower half just to protect it from any painting that I might do in a minute. And speaking of painting, I'm going to be using this Tamiya gloss aluminium rattle can. I like to do the absolute minimum of steps, so I've prepared all of the parts which need to be painted aluminium. This includes the landing gear components, internal elements of the cockpit, and also the landing gear bays. With that done, some interior grey-green would be painted onto the areas that need it inside of the cockpit, following the painting instructions included inside the kit. Whilst this is an airbrush ready paint, it can kind of be hand painted, but it might not give the neatest of results. For my needs though, I was fairly happy to use it. Vallejo black would be used to paint the control panel and a few other select details. There is a decal for the control panel, so I'll use some Mr. Hobby Mr. Mark setter, which is a bit like a decal glue, to stick the decal onto the control panel area. The decal had been soaked in warm water released from the backing paper and then slid into position. That setting solution should help stick it onto the surface of the part, and then when it was all done, some Mr. Mark softer would be used to further soften the decal into the surface. I then started assembling the various elements of the cockpit which have already been painted, with the pilot's chair being added onto sort of the backrest, and then this could be installed inside the aircraft. This was then followed by installing the control panel part. It is a little bit fiddly, and you do have to get things lined up correctly in order for them to fit just right. When that was done, the two fuselage halves could be joined together. And again, just for a little bit of neatness, the seams would be sanded down just to make them look a little smoother. And then when that was done, the fuselage was joined onto the wings, placing it over the top of the rudder pedals and control column, which are already glued on. The lower side of the tail can then be added. This kit has been designed in such a way that there are actually different options, so I had to make sure I selected the correct part of the tail for this. And this was then followed by gluing on the horizontal tail surfaces, as well as the rudder. I will build the air intakes at this point as well, but I'll actually keep them off of the model until I've done some painting, because I think that'll be just a little easier. I will add the aerial mast though, but I will have to be careful when handling this kit now, just to make sure I don't knock it off. And so too, I'll add the pitot tube on the bottom. I like to do things at this point to get a good plastic to plastic bond, but the risk of knocking them off is a bit higher. That small part that I mentioned earlier, which I had to use a drill to open a hole for, can then be glued in on the side of the cockpit. And because this represents an early version of the Hawker Hurricane, it comes with a 2-blade propeller. This was built up in a fairly simple way, and if you're careful with your glue, you should have a freely rotating prop by the end of the build. I like the way that Airfix have designed this propeller because you don't have to add it to the model until after you've painted it. I have painted the included pilot off camera using my normal techniques, and I glued him into place here. Fortunately, in this case, no modification of the pilot was required. I've been out and bought a Montex mini mask set for this particular aircraft kit. These self-adhesive masks should work well to protect the clear parts during the painting stages. Unfortunately, I have struggled a little with Montex masks in the past. I find that their mask sheets are a little thick and don't always conform to the frames and panels of the clear parts. Hopefully though, because this is a fairly simple cockpit canopy, it should be reasonably okay. The pieces of tape were peeled from their backing sheet and then carefully positioned and pressed down onto the relevant panels on the clear parts. I do enjoy using mask sets because it just speeds up this part of the build. I won't be adding this onto the model yet though. I'll actually keep them off and paint them separately and add them onto the aircraft later. As a side note, I am going to be displaying this aircraft with its wheels down, but I am using the raised landing gear option to act as masks and protect that aluminium paint in the landing gear bays. And now it's time to prime. So first up, I'm going to be using this Tamiya fine white primer. This particular aircraft has a two-tone underside, one half being white and one half being black. So I painted the underside in a white colour to start with. Some other elements that you can see here, such as a landing gear door, would also be painted white. Moving on to the black part, I would use this Army Painter matte black primer. I've already carefully masked the halves of the aircraft which need to stay white, which means that I should have a nice neat edge for this black paint to be applied to. I would also flip the aircraft over and prime the upper surfaces in black as well. This should just give a good surface for the subsequent camouflage paints to stick to. And speaking of camouflage, I'm going to be using the Vallejo colours for this. Dark earth would be loaded into my airbrush. I do generally add just a drop of thinner just to prevent tip dry, but otherwise these are airbrush ready paints and can be used straight from the bottle. Having masked the undersides, This meant that I didn't have to be too careful with my application of this paint. However, I would try and do a little bit of modulation with the paintwork just to try and make some of the panels have slightly different shades. With that done, I now need to mask the brown so I can paint the green. And I'm going to be using this AML camouflage mask set. I do quite like using these. Again, it makes things a little bit quicker, but naturally you are paying for that speed. These vinyl masks were carefully peeled away from the sheet, the correct places identified, and then they were stuck into position. Generally, I don't have any problems using these masks. I do like the way they work, and they do fit onto the aircraft reasonably well. There may be a few places here and there where you have to use a little bit of your own tape just to help them stick down or to cover any gaps that they don't quite fit over, but for the most part they work perfectly fine. For the green, I'm going to be using Vallejo Dark Green, and again this was loaded into the airbrush and then sprayed over the top of the aircraft. Those masks should act to give a nice clean edge between the green and the brown. I did have to make sure not to forget to paint the cockpit canopy and windscreen as well at this point. And when those paints were dry, I peeled away the vinyl masks and it's revealed a fairly neat camouflage scheme. As an interesting point, if you're careful with your masks, you might be able to put them back on your masking sheet and then you can reuse them on another project. Next up, I'm going to mix this semi-matte varnish and black together to make a really thin black paint. So on this particular kit, and this is something that had been putting me off about building it, is that on the sort of outside of the roundels, it doesn't really show up too well here, but on the outside of the roundels, originally I think this aircraft would have had like a yellow band around the roundels, but when it was deployed to France just before the start of the Second World War, they would have overpainted that to make it less obvious and less noticeable. So they would have overpainted it with something they had access to there. And the sort of indication on the instructions, it does say that it would be a slightly darker colour. So what they've suggested is adding a little bit of dark paint to it to simulate the fact they overpainted it, and it's not quite a perfect match. But in my case, what I've actually thought about doing is creating a sort of thin paint which can act almost as a glaze and just tint those colours that are already there and give the impression that it's been overpainted. This was the simplest way that I could think of doing it, but I guess we'll have to see how it turns out. So to facilitate this, I actually decided to use my Cricut machine to make my own vinyl mask for these roundels. On the wings, I cut out some circles, which were 17mm in diameter, and on the fuselage they were 12.25mm in diameter. These were then peeled from the backing sheet and stuck onto the relatively correct places. It was a bit difficult to do with the way I designed the masks, but I'm pretty sure they're in the right places, and stuck down. So these are like homemade masks I've done here. This very thin black glaze, I'll kind of call it a glaze, I don't really know if that would be a better term for it, but this was airbrushed over those areas. And then when it was dry, I would peel them away, and you can see that it's got these kind of black circles now where the roundels are going to go. It does look a bit weird at this point, but I'm hoping once I get the roundels on from the decal sheet, it will start to make a little bit more sense. Whilst I've got this paint loaded into the airbrush, what I decided to do was actually simulate smoke staining as well. 2 birds, 1 stone and all that. So I carefully streaked it back from the engine exhaust areas to try and give the impression that the engine has been running and there is smoke staining here. This is all the smoke staining I'm going to do though. I'm not going to add any to the wing gun ports because I think this is a pre-war aircraft. It probably won't have been using its guns that much. And with that done, I moved on to the decals. So you only get one small sheet of decals in this kit. There's only one decal scheme included, but they are printed by Cartograph and they are to a lovely quality. I cut them into more manageable sizes and then soaked them in some warm water to help release them from the backing paper. And if you're like me and you keep getting confused between your paint water and your brush water, why don't you get a brush water mug? Check out my merch store and it helps support the channel. That would not be pleasant. I would not enjoy drinking that. With the decals suitably soaked, they were released from the backing paper and then carefully positioned in the correct places as indicated by the painting instructions. It would seem that I more or less got those painted circles in the correct places because the other decals managed to go around them with no real issues. The decal application step was relatively straightforward. There aren't that many of them, so it doesn't take too long. There are quite a few stencils though, perhaps a few more than I've experienced on other similar kits from Airfix, but they were not unmanageable. When the decals were in place, some more Mr. Mark Softer would be painted over the top to help soften them into the surface of the model and try and make them look as though they were painted on. Whilst those decals are curing, I'm going to use some gunmetal paint on the exhaust pipes, which I've already primed in black. I'd also use this on the internal areas of the engine radiators which go on the bottom of the aircraft. This 174 signal red would be carefully painted onto the front part of the propeller spinner. The propeller has already been painted black, which I did during the black primer stage. For the tips of the propeller blades, some Humbrol 24 yellow would be used. I'm not entirely happy with the engine exhausts in their gunmetal shade, so some dirty down rust was thinned with some water and then brushed over the top of the engine exhausts. I'm hoping that it won't give a rusty look, but more of a burnt metal kind of finish. That's why I've thinned it down. If I'm not too happy though, I can reactivate this particular paint with some more water and work it around as much as I like until I get what I'm looking for. Flipping over to the lower side, the raised landing gear parts were carefully removed to help reveal a landing gear bay which has mostly survived the painting process. I then added the various details on the lower half of the model, which have already been painted in the two-tone black and white. I thought it easy to paint them off of the aircraft in order to get this black and white camouflage scheme looking quite neat. The tail wheel, which I've suitably painted, was glued into the rear of the aircraft, and then the main landing gear legs could also be glued into place. It is a little bit fiddly adding these. They do actually have to pass through parts of the landing gear sort of structure in order to get in the right places, but it is possible to do. With the additional strut added to help support the landing gear leg, the landing gear door could then be glued on as well. This would then be followed by the wheels, making sure to put the correct wheel on the correct leg because they have a flattened surface to simulate the weight of the aircraft pushing through the tyre, and you want that to sit flat. With that done, this semi-matte varnish was loaded into my airbrush and then painted over the entire model to help seal in all the decals and give a uniform finish, ready for a little bit of weathering. And speaking of weathering, I'm just going to apply my very simple homemade wash, which consists of Humbrol 79 blue-grey enamel thinned down with white spirit to make a very, very thin paint. This was then brushed over the entire model and allowed to run into all the details and recessed panel lines. Any excess that I'm not particularly happy with could be carefully removed using a cotton bud soaked in some more white spirit. But I'm hoping that because I've thinned this down as much as I have, it should not need removing and will instead accumulate in all of the recessed areas. When that was done and dry, this matte varnish would be loaded into the airbrush and then applied over the entire aircraft to help dull down that slightly shiny finish. This should help blend everything in and give a more realistic, dull finish to the paintwork. With that done, the engine exhausts were carefully glued into their relevant sides of the nose, and the propeller glued into the front of the aircraft. I do want to add some aerial wire, so I've got some Ushi Rig That Thing thin thread, and a small amount of super glue was applied to the mounting points on the tail and the aerial mast. The thin thread was attached and the glue allowed to cure, and then it was stretched over the second mounting point and the process repeated. Any excess thread could be carefully trimmed away. Perhaps this thread is a little thin and not that noticeable in pictures and in the video, but it's probably fairly scale accurate, I would like to think. I had masked the cockpit area and the pilot so that the paints didn't get on there, and they seem to have worked perfectly fine, so those were removed. And then so too were the Montex masks from the canopy parts. Again, these seem to have worked generally okay. There are some areas where they perhaps haven't quite conformed to the shape of the canopy windows. They are a little thicker than other mask sets I've used in the past, but in this particular build, they seem to have worked okay. Anything I wasn't too happy with, I could carefully clean up with a cocktail stick. Humbrol Clear Fix is a glue which I can use on the clear parts which won't react with them, and it was used to carefully attach them onto the aircraft. It is a little bit stringy, so some care had to be taken when adding it onto the model. So at this point you can see that I'm trying to attach the rear part of the canopy, the sliding part, into an open position, and technically the instructions don't tell you to do this. There is technically no open position included in the kit, and there might be a reason for this. So I'm trying to attach it in an open position here, but it's sitting too high, it's sitting too proud. And what I did was I pushed it down a little bit and it cracked. I wasn't filming at that point, but in the finished pictures and video you might be able to notice a small crack along the center line, which means it's just opened up enough to fit and look a bit better, but it's not designed to be in an open position, and I think that's why. I think maybe if you'd warmed the plastic up and it had a little bit more flex, it might have conformed to that shape, but it's not inherently designed to be in an open position. So I was pretty happy with the build up until this point, and then I cracked this plastic part, but there's no point doing anything about it now. I think I'm just going to move on. Some matte aluminium paint was used on the landing lights on the leading edges of the wings, and then the clear parts which represent them were glued into place, again using some Humbrol Clear Fix. The final step was to remember to remove that small amount of liquid mask from the light on the bottom of the aircraft. And with that, I'm going to call my build of the Airfix Hawker Hurricane Mk.1 in 1/72 scale complete. And that's another build under the belt. So this is a kit that I actually really enjoy. I have built a couple of these kits in the past, and the main reason I got this one is because it represents an earlier version with a two-bladed propeller. All the ones I've done previously have been the slightly later versions with the three-bladed propeller. Of course, this particular tooling only represents an early version with the fabric wings. I don't think Airfix does currently have a metal skinned version. So this is pretty much it, but it does come in a different variety of boxings at times, some with three-bladed propellers representing a slightly later version, or extra parts to represent an early version like I have here. Before I get into my full review though, I always think it's good to hear some more thoughts or a second opinion from another modeler out there. And this version that I've done here isn't actually the most recent version, it's not the most recent release. So what I'd actually like to do is hand you over to FJ Modelling to hear their thoughts on this particular kit. Over to you.
Hello everyone, firstly I want to thank Matt for allowing me to showcase my build and my experience with this kit on the channel. So getting into the kit, for me it was actually quite a struggle. I made a lot of silly mistakes and it was a bit of a learning experience for me. From trying to hand paint the camouflage on with an airbrush to completely messing up the masking and allowing the aluminium paint to get all over the top half of my nicely repainted camouflage. This kit provided a lot of learning experiences for me, and through mistakes of my own. I feel like I really just started to rush this kit, trying to get a nice build video out, and in the end it wasn't the best modelling I've ever done. I feel my end result, however, all things considered, was pretty good. There was a few things I missed out, like the shading around the decals. I remember I was supposed to do it, and then I completely forgot to do it during the build, which was a very silly mistake on my part. However, I feel like my kit wasn't too bad. The experience of building the kit was great. I think I just made quite a few bad mistakes. If you want to watch me make those mistakes and point and laugh, I guess, feel free to check out the video on my channel where I build and review this kit. I built a slightly different boxing to Matt. I think I did the more recent one, the 2024 release, which is the same tooling but with a slightly different decal scheme. But yeah, feel free to come check it out on my channel, and thank you very much for allowing me to showcase myself on the Model Minutes channel.
Thanks to FJ Modelling there for sharing their experience with this build. FJ Modelling is a new channel here on YouTube, just starting out, and I'm sure that they would love some gentle encouragement and some guidance, so do feel free to go and check them out. But yeah, people tend to make mistakes. I made mistakes in this build as well. You definitely have some areas that you've already identified for improvement, and I'm sure that in the future you will find them. But yeah, I would agree this is a good kit. It's a lovely tooling. It's a nice representation of the Hawker Hurricane. It does come with some nice options. FJ Modelling did the more recent boxing, which actually comes with 2 different paint schemes, and it's a Series 2 kit, which means it's a little bit more expensive than the version that I did in this video. So the kit that I built then, a quick review of this one would be that this is a 2020 release of a 2013 tooling. I picked this one up because I'd never done an early Mk.1 before, and then it kind of got shelved and sort of forgotten about. Those extra bits about painting around the roundels, that kind of threw me a little bit, but actually now with extra experience, I think I found a way that kind of works with it. It kind of looks like what it's supposed to look like. Positives of this kit are that there's not much flash. The 63 parts that were included were moulded to a good quality and had a good level of detail. Of course, not all of them were required because you get extra bits as well, which represent slightly later versions too. So we only needed the early version parts. You only get 1 paint scheme, and the decals are printed to a good quality, and the painting instructions are in full colour. Perhaps the painting instructions are a little small, but that's because they're on the back of the box. Decals were lovely, they were manageable to apply. Perhaps the little stencils were a little bit tedious, but that's just me, I don't really like doing stencils. There weren't that many of them though, so it wasn't that long or arduous of a process. Of course, this boxing may not really be available at the moment, and you may have to look for the more recent version, which does retail for £11.99, but it does come with 2 different paint schemes. The version that I did when it was originally on sale was recommended retail at £8.99, which naturally reflects the fact that it only had 1 paint scheme. And it is a little bit more pocket money in its kind of aim. It is a small boxing, it's a single kit. It's something that you could do in a weekend. And in actual fact, I do keep a log of everything that I do in my little journals. If you'd like to get one and keep track of your own builds on your own workbenches, check out my links below the video. But I did this in 3 days. This was a 3-day build. So yeah, actually on the whole, pretty happy with this one. Nice and quick, nice and simple. Fit of the parts was nice, relatively straightforward process. The only thing that I'm annoyed about was cracking the cockpit canopy. It's my fault. The instructions don't tell you to glue it in an open position. They tell you to glue it in a closed position. And I think this is why. It's because if you try, you might crack it. And I did. You can't really notice the crack from like normal viewing distances, but if you get close enough, you can see it and it is there. I didn't see the point in doing anything about it. It is what it is and it's there and I'm just gonna have to live with it. But other than that, you know, it would have been a fairly, in my opinion, flawless build, fairly straightforward, fairly simple, pretty enjoyable. The only other thing perhaps is the Montex masks don't quite work. I mean, they work better than I've experienced on other kits. It's usually when they try and conform to a curved surface, they don't work so well. So I did have to tidy up the edges just a little bit, but you know, they worked okay. But it does seem to be a bit of a par for the course with the Montex masks at the moment, is that they don't quite work. They work okay, but not perfectly. But yeah, on the whole, I'm actually pretty happy with this one. This was a nice kind of weekend build. I really like the way this one looks. I'm glad that my sort of painting, my homemade masks for those outside bits of the roundels, that came off quite well. I think it kind of gives the impression that it's meant to. Yeah, on the whole, probably would buy one of these again. I mean, I would probably try and get one with a different paint scheme. I want to do a different version, or maybe I could just get a generic boxing and get some aftermarket decals so I can do something a little bit different, a little bit more visually interesting. But yeah, let me know down in the comments what you think of my build and whether my assessment of this kit was fair. Quick shout out to my Model Club members for the extra support they give the channel. Massive thanks to these guys on screen, and if you'd like to join them or support the channel in other ways, please do check out the links in the description. Of course, the best way to support this channel for free is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Once again, quick shout out to FJ Modelling. Thanks to you for sharing your thoughts on this build, and do go and check them out. Finally though, last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time. And if you keep getting confused about your cup of tea or your brush water, make sure you get a brush water What am I trying to say? I'm not even on the right thing. I'm not even on the right folder. Probably should have the folder open so I know which model I'm talking about. Hurricane. There you are. I like to try and keep my painting steps to an absolute minimum. So here you can see that I've got the wing assemblies, which are going to be painted, the internal areas in there. Airfix Hawker Hurricane Mk.1. Build and review. Still don't know. I don't know where my clapperboard has gone. I've had a look. I genuinely have had a look for it. I can't find it. It's here somewhere. It has to be here somewhere. I don't really want to buy another one though. I wonder how many videos I'll get through before I find it. And to make sure that you don't get confused between your cup of tea and your brush water mug, why don't you check out my merch store and get yourself one of these clearly identifiable... No, I don't know what I'm saying. The decal application step was relatively straightforward. Right, how do I turn this off? With the amount of videos I make, you'd think I'd know how to turn this off by now.